This week, we speak with Ryan Kelso from 10sec Inc. In the news segment, percent encoding hits a percentage of phishing success, intelligent tracking protection hits more link decorations, API Security Top 10 hits release candidate status, and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. False positives suck. With so many mobile apps to test, how much time will you waste on false positives? Eliminate them today with NowSecure. Only NowSecure automates static, dynamic, and interactive testing on real Android and iOS devices. Now you get speed, accuracy, and efficiency for DevOps, plus the broadest coverage of security, compliance, and privacy issues. Why waste time on false positives? Visit securityweekly.com/NowSecure to learn how to scale your mobile AppSec testing with NowSecure. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences' patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 78, recorded September 30th, 2019. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Matt Alderman. Hey, Matt.
Good morning, Mike.
Good morning. John remains elusive this week. I think he's experimenting with hostless podcasting, it seems, that every once in a while. We have exciting news about the Security Weekly webcast program. We are now partnered with IC2 as an official CPE provider. If you attend any of our webcasts, you will be receiving 1 CPE credit per webcast. Register for one of our upcoming webcasts with Tom Stitt of ExtraHop, or Mavul Ravankar of SaltStack, or Steve Lobenstein of Core Security, or Bryce Schroeder of ServiceNow, or all of them, by going to securityweekly.com/webcasts. If you have missed any of our previously recorded webcasts, you can find our on-demand library at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Security Weekly will be at Hacker Halted in Atlanta, Georgia this October 10th and 11th. If you are attending and would like to sponsor an interview, please submit your interest on our conference request form at securityweekly.com/booking. EC Council is offering our listeners a $100 discount to attend the 2-day conference. Use discount code HH19SW when you register, or go to securityweekly.com/hackerhalted and register there. Ryan Kelso is a former developer turned application security engineer with a passion for giving back to the security community that has helped him out tremendously with getting him into this field. Hello, Ryan, and thank you for joining us today.
Good morning. How you doing?
Pretty good. One of the things that we brought you here to talk about are information disclosure vulnerabilities, because you just recently, I think gave a presentation on that. But before we get into the information disclosure itself, what about a little bit of information about you? You come into security from a development background, is that right?
Yeah. So a lot of my background is pretty much software development. I started writing software when I was about 8 with IRC chatbots, and kind of grew from there into getting my associates, and kind of got the piece of paper that said I knew what I was doing. So started doing that, and from there got my Security Plus, my Cybersecurity Analyst Plus, and natural fit from there for application security.
That's cool. And was there a particular bug or particular security test that happened that pulled you into that application security realm, or what was it that planted the seed of interest for you?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think the biggest thing for me that got me interested in doing security was kind of simply put, that the best practices for security, right, are kind of inherently good software practices. So I think one of my big mentors when I was doing software development was kind of pushing best practices heavily. So it was one of those things I just naturally saw that a lot of security issues stem from lack of using best practices. And from there, it was just a natural fit.
That's pretty cool. And it's pretty interesting to hear too that, security problems are kind of, as you're describing, fundamental just, software problems or software engineering. How does that tie in when you have now a security hat on and working with developers and talking with developers about security issues? Meaning in terms of giving them the right tools, giving them the right understanding about building more secure software.
Yeah, so I think with the security hat on, it's one of those things is I focus obviously a lot of my time on understanding new attack vectors and new deficiencies in software, but ultimately all of those are just thinking around the rules put in place by the software engineers. So in order to kind of work with them and get them to see this, it's the same way you phrase any bug in a piece of software, right? Is, hey, here's what it's supposed to do. Here's how I got around or abused the code that you wrote, and here's how it needs to be fixed, right?
And that I think leads us into a lot about even like information disclosures, because those are they tend to maybe be looked down on or not as exciting as the direct obvious hacker feedback loop of a SQL injection or cross-site scripting. But you're definitely using that type of information leaks and misconfigurations maybe to pick apart an application and do what it wasn't expecting to do. So what made you focus on information disclosure? And then let's talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the biggest thing that I saw within the space and within my position specifically is that we have a lot of attack surface, right? When your company does large applications, there's a lot of attack surface, and there can be a lot of vulnerabilities that you have to triage. And when you are first building a security program, you start finding a lot of issues. And so it's pretty easy to put the low priority ones, the low risk level findings to the bottom. The problem with that is a lot of the tools and other standards for scoring vulnerabilities don't necessarily look at context. So you may have information disclosure within your application, such as verbose errors or verbose headers, but they get scored low because a lot of those findings you can't do anything with, right? Like if you get some source code from an error, okay, it gives you a little bit of information, but you can't leverage that to steal information to cause a DDoS attack or what have you. So I saw that while that's true in a lot of cases, if you have it enabled, the developer has to always have that present in their mind. And so it's one of those things that's super easy to fix, right? It's just a small configuration change. It can be as little as 4 characters from true to false to turn on some of these things. And so it's like these, while low, can have huge impact, right? Verbose errors can leak credentials to databases, to other connected systems, to your AWS accounts, things like that, which can have a lot of impact, but you don't always see it on every single error.
Yeah, and I think the challenge with the vulnerability scoring system in general is that information leakage like that or disclosure isn't a critical vulnerability from the aspect of a potential exploit in the wild and it's remotely executable, et cetera. But when you bring in the other two elements, right? When you bring in things like understanding the impact to the organization and how does that affect the risk side, which a lot of the vulnerability management solutions don't really understand, then now you start to see where those types of vulnerabilities actually probably should be a little higher on some sort of remediation plan.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So then, how do you?
Oh, go ahead, Mike.
I was going to ask Ryan, when you're talking with developers, or kind of because you mentioned on the one hand these are sort of easy to ignore from the sense of by default, some vulnerability tool may just rate them low, and so they're easier to deprioritize. But as you're pointing out, the context can make them more interesting. How do you have those conversations with developers without having to go into a long explanation, or maybe you have to go into a long explanation of all the things that could go wrong by this, or how this could be part of like an exploit chain?
So that's actually a really good question, and it's one that I've personally struggled with, right? Is conveying the risk of these low risk, quote unquote, vulnerabilities while not having to have an hour long meeting, right? And so for me, it's the easiest explanation of, while you may not see the immediate impact, you have to be aware of this vulnerability for every single piece of code that you write. And any piece of code that you write that leaks a piece of information through one of these errors is damaging. So you have to have that in mind every single time you write. And so it's just more that you have to think about and more you have to prepare for, right? So I may not even be able to immediately exploit a verbose error within the system, but that doesn't mean that 2 months down the road, 3 months down the road, while we're still trying to remediate, it's not going to have an impact from new code written.
Hmm. And now, do you see
Yeah.
like deploying to cloud? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, is there an easy way to catch some of these information disclosures as part of the development and build process instead of waiting till these applications are live and then, a dynamic scanner goes out and finds them?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this, as I stated at the beginning, this comes back to software best practices, right? Best practices are to turn off your verbose errors, to turn off extraneous headers, any of your standard server hardening and software application hardening best practice guides out there tell you to do all of these things. And part of CI/CD and other deployment pipelines, right, whatever that may be for you, should be automatically checking these, because like verbose errors are a very important part of development, right? If I'm writing a new piece of software or extending existing software, I want to see those errors happen and I want to get some more information about what failed in my software without having to dig into my system logs and see what happened. So that's really helpful part of development, but it needs to be automatically flipped off in your configuration files, and your production IIS and Apache and all those should be default set up to have those turned off.
And so, do you see those practices being easier with like more modern CI/CD pipelines that can distinguish between staging, production? Because, like you said, verbose error messages are kind of important for debugging complex applications. It is actually really helpful to have logging and monitoring of apps, but it's how do you still get that type of visibility in production without making these mistakes that attackers might be able to leverage?
The biggest thing that I see that you need to be doing in production, right, is part of OWASP top 10, right? You need to be logging. So if you're not logging and you're relying on verbose errors, then you will have one of the other OWASP top 10 findings, which is insufficient logging and monitoring, right?
Mhm.
So I think you can kill two birds with one stone. You get rid of the insufficient logging by adding logging, and you get visibility into what went wrong with your production application. Because as every developer knows, just because it works on my machine doesn't mean it works in production, right? And so that's part of it.
Yeah. And what about like with development shops moving to cloud or deploying to cloud? Do you find that like the cloud service providers have make it easier or harder for developers, to make these mistakes? Meaning like, the mistake of verbose error messages are actually easier to tweak in production systems, or there's so many APIs, there's so much going on and nuance within these cloud environments that you're finding a lot of small information disclosures in a lot of new and interesting areas.
That's a tough one. I don't know that I have specifically seen where cloud has helped or hindered. I know a lot of the default configurations, if you're using some of the platforms as a service that are hosted in cloud, a lot of their default configurations are a lot better than, if you're spinning up your own IaaS instance and setting up all of your C# projects and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So I do see it as helping a lot more than it's hindering, but as someone who dealt with early days of Azure, some of that documentation can be just plain wrong or just really hard to get through to find where you need to toggle this little switch to change something like that.
That's interesting. I know, and I think you mentioned C sharp just now, and I think quite often a lot of these problems are very independent of programming languages. But when you talk to developers and their programming languages, do you often get into different languages have particular quirks that you often have to look out for, be more careful of in terms of the type of debug information they might expose?
For sure. I know for the by and large, a lot of them handle it the same way, right? You have a configuration file somewhere, then you can turn on debug on or debug off. However, within my presentation, I point out specifically that one of the it's called PDO exception within PHP is that it specifically warns you that if you're handling this area of the application and you don't catch the PDO exception, it will leak database credentials. It tells you that in the documentation. And I do find some of the older languages who hold a lot of legacy features have things like this. I know I've seen in Python specifically where it's like, oh no, we have this insecure implementation. You need to be using this correct one, this more secure implementation. It's like you have to really read the docs because if you're just looking through Stack Overflow, you can run into something as simple as, oh, just do it this way, and you do it, and you don't realize that that post is from 4 years ago, right? And that's not the secure way to do it. So you can run into those issues where it's definitely language specific to doing things incorrectly.
Yeah, especially if you're
Yeah,
pulling an old set of libraries and binaries, especially PHP. It's vulnerable. It's
Yeah,
crazy.
yeah.
exactly.
Cutting and pasting from Stack Overflow, the programmer's dream, right? Oh.
Yes, exactly.
So what about then? So it's one thing to say, sure, it was in the documentation with big warnings that, oh, by the way, this will actually leak anything up to potentially even the database credentials. But obviously, not everybody reads into those specific documentation, and in the code base, that documentation doesn't get carried over when you're actually reading through the implementation. So, do you see an approach like static analysis or even simple like grepping or linting has helped with finding these types of vulnerabilities? Or what would be a way that you would go about trying to work with your developers to make it easier for them to root out these types of mistakes?
That's a really tough one to answer. I have I have mixed feelings on static analysis.
Hmm.
I currently deal with that a lot, right? That's one of the big components of my job is looking through static analysis findings. But if you're starting a security program and they've never done a static analysis scan at all, and you do a scan and it comes back with 1,800, 2,000 findings, well, now I get my nice cut of work to dig through all of those findings. And by and large, I find a lot of them are false positive or mitigated. Um, so it's hard for me to say that static analysis would help remediate some of these because some of it just gets lost in the noise, right? So if you get 1,800 of the exact same finding over and over again, it's easy to look at three of them and go, well, these are all the same, and then throw them all out, which can be very dangerous. So I don't know that I've seen linting can definitely help for sure. Because that helps with a lot of bad practices and can deal a lot with code smells. Um, so I find some value in some of these tools. Some of the modern JS tools are helping a lot with how looking at how you're using some of the language specific features. So those are very helpful.
Yeah, I think both the linting tools, and then there's also been some really good plugins for some of the different languages library-wise that I think have done a pretty decent job of identifying potential issues in your code, flagging them at bare minimum, and even some of them actually recommend changes to the code to make it actually work better. And it's those types of integration points that I think are really interesting for developers to actually check their code and then learn from that to build better code.
Yes, definitely. I definitely see there being a lot of room to grow. And I know when I was writing code, I loved the plugins into my, Visual Studio or whatever IDE I was using that helped with identifying simple mistakes, especially if it was like I was really new to a language and I was just learning through some of the documentation and some examples. It'd be like, oh, no, you're doing this wrong. You need to do it this way. This is the better way to do it. Whether it's for performance or for security, I think there's a lot of room to grow in that space. And I know some of the vendors that I've dealt with are starting to offer more IDE integrations because it just helps developers way faster than developing all the code and then running something like a static analysis.
Yeah, it also
And
moves the identification of the bug a little closer to home.
Yep, move left.
Yeah, and it also sounds like, dealing with if all those, static analysis results are coming into you and you're dealing with trying to root through, 1,800, 2,000 results, and these are false positives, or these are, the context makes them already mitigated elsewhere. And how then do you then turn around and what do you take to developers? Or have you gotten a habit where you say, you know what, I really care about these two or three particular scenarios or these two or three issues, and if you get rid of them, you can get rid of a higher than average amount of risk. So do you have that kind of short list in mind as you're going through results like this or talking with developers?
Yes, I generally do, right? When you look at a large number of findings that are all identical, right, and you start to get a picture of what the stack analysis tool is keying in on, whether that's just a comment above a password field or property and it's / password and it says, oh, there's hard-coded passwords here. It's like, no, that's just the word password. You can see what it's doing, and so you can kind of give advice to developers to kind of help them not have all these findings, right? Because there's only so many application security engineers who can look at stack analysis findings. A lot of the onus could or should be on developers looking at their code because they have better context and better knowledge of the overall architecture. So some of them are definitely comment based, or you see a bad architectural design that may work in practice, but in the security tool, it really dislikes it because of one reason or another. And it could be come back to, right, it's not best practice. While it may work and it may not have a vulnerability in it, it's not the best practice. And the tool really dislikes it because of this weird scenario that could make it vulnerable.
And that's interesting because as we mentioned earlier too, you're coming at this from actually a development background. So what would you say to application security teams, or what would be good for an application security team to keep in mind if they perhaps don't have a deeper development background in order when they come to development teams, to a DevOps team with recommendations or comments or results from these types of tools? What can they do to better steer that conversation with the DevOps team?
I think the biggest one is understanding what the ultimate cause of the issue is, right? Like if you're just coming at it from stack analysis, since we're on that topic, and you see a finding and you don't understand why there's all of these findings, and you're just like, hey, you have 50 instances of this issue, you need to remediate these. And then they come back and are like, well, wait a minute, that's going to take like 3 months of work because it'll require us to basically re-architect an entire section of the application. That's fundamentally how it works. So when you're going into it, it's very helpful to understand the root cause of why you have the vulnerability and not just the finding itself, right? It's helpful to give them context on how it can be attacked, but on the flip side, it's not necessarily always an easy fix. It may seem like an easy fix, like, oh, just don't do this. Okay, well, that's nice. Have you seen our code base? Not everybody has nice green-field modern applications.
Yeah, it's called technical debt, and it's something that takes time to fix as you're out trying to build other features to keep the business moving forward. Just ask Paul, because he's doing that right now.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I wonder too, with that, do you see, information disclosure? I think it's pretty old. It's been around for a while, still around here, but I'm going to guess then it doesn't just exist in the legacy tech debt area code. There's new code being written that still has these problems. So sort of, I guess, and if that is the case, what would you what's a good looking forward approach to maybe improving on this? We mentioned like static analysis a little bit. We mentioned linting. Is there something else that you would really love to see, or a tool that you would love to have that could make this problem be less prominent?
Yeah, so you used to see some of these things on some of these automated tools that would just visit your site and look at the responses and tell you like, oh, your TLS is good, your response times are good. And some of these tools have kind of gone by the wayside. And I think the biggest, for me, the biggest way to find these things is just simply hygiene. You see a lot of development shops moving faster and faster, right? We want to be able to deploy to production 10, 100 times a day, as many times as we want to or need to. And that's amazing. And I love that as a developer, and I love to be able to get code through a pipeline really quickly. The problem is you have to plan. You have to plan very, very thoroughly. And a lot of the CI/CD pipeline tools, whether that's your Team Cities, your GitLab CIs, etc., they provide configuration management to go through your have a configuration for your development environment, to put in a configuration for your test environment, etc. And a lot of these teams are doing this. They have different databases. They're going to need different database credentials to be swapped out every time it goes to a different environment. So a lot of these are already being done. The problem is they don't think to check that one box for the verbose errors because it was useful to them and they didn't think that it needed to be turned off in production because maybe they have a very tough testing environment. So they only have one test environment and they have, to be very select about what gets into that test environment because of how big it is. And so they can't necessarily test everything 100%, and so it has to go into production. And they really like having the verbose errors because they can just go to the client and say, oh, you got this error, what did it look like? And then they can just send them a screenshot and it's fixed. A lot faster than having to make a request to the engineering or the network ops team and get network ops pulled out and pull the logs and then do a look through hundreds or thousands, maybe millions of lines of logs to find the issue. And so that's where I would like to see more of, is to just have a built-in way within the CI/CD pipeline to flag and go, hey, you're not doing this, this, and this. Should you be? I think you should. Here's some recommendations, and then go from there.
Cool. And
yeah,
it sounds like
we're starting to see some of those tools emerge, but I'd like to see more of them because I think it is the faster place to fix it. It's also less costly to the organization if they can fix it during the coding process versus letting it get all the way into production and then have to go back and retrofit code.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I was going to add too, because you're also emphasizing that these are the tools focused for the developers and the DevOps team actually building the code, rather than here is yet another, security tool in your tool chest that you would run from the AppSec perspective and then bring the results over to the team, and so on. So that's also kind of a nice perspective to add to it. Looking ahead, you were looking at information disclosure, and you mentioned earlier too. Another one of the OWASP top 10, insufficient logging. Is there another of the OWASP top 10 on your radar that you're starting to think about for maybe another presentation next year?
Yeah, so that's a really poignant question, and I've thought about doing this, and I primarily go to security conferences these days, right? My focus is in security, but I find as we've talked through this as well, it's a lot of these issues stem from developers not knowing or not being aware of the issue, right? A lot of developers don't know how us AppSec folks do our work and how we can exploit these things. I've presented to some developers, and they'll go, "Well, I don't understand how you can get that attack to work. How do you even do that, right? If I'm modifying a post request or something, they don't understand necessarily how that happens." And so I think for next year, I kind of want to go through and have a talk on practical OWASP top 10. And I've played with that some on some of the local security groups, specifically our OWASP chapter locally, is presenting here's what the OWASP top 10 looks like practically, and here's how I exploit all of them as an attacker, and here's how you can defend against it, and present this more at development and developer conferences than security conferences.
That sounds like a great angle because, yeah, why go to and tell the security people and the AppSec people stuff they perhaps already know, or just maybe you're adding one or two nuggets of wisdom there and go straight to developer conferences. That sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, and there's a lot more of them these days to go after and help to educate. I mean, there's a whole new set of conferences spinning up that, this kind of training would actually benefit them.
Exactly. And that's kind of where I got my start, right? Is I just started digging at how do attackers attack my software. I wanted to write better, more robust software and not have it break when someone was doing something they weren't supposed to be doing. And I think a lot more developers need to see that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Ryan, I hope a lot more developers over the next year see you and see your presentations as you start to build them up and start to take them around different conferences. That sounds pretty good.
Thank you.
Cool. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to thank Matt once again. And Ryan, we're going to look for more information disclosure from you. You disclose a lot of good information and good wisdom for us. We're going to take a quick break now, and we're going to return with news of the week.